The topic I want to discuss today is the relationship between scientific discourse, ideology, and power in the humanities. And I would like to begin by pointing out the following questions. Why is it that research methodologies founded upon positivist premises still hold so much influence and power in the way knowledge is seen and research is carried out in the humanities? Why is it that the positivist scientific belief that truth can only be attained through the experimental method or through quantitative methodologies still prevails in the way in which social sciences are carried out? I want to look back at the warning which the father of phenomenology gave us all the way back in the 1930s, Edmund Husserl, in his famous lectures on the crisis of European sciences. Edmund Husserl was able to see, and nobody contests, the capacity of scientific discourse of explaining natural phenomena, the ability and precision of scientific knowledge when it comes to explaining natural phenomena, be it the universe, laws of motion, orbits of planets, or the structure of living things, is uncontested. However, that type of knowledge which relies purely on facts, on what is demonstrable through the laboratory, on what is quantifiable, is very limited when it comes to the need for meaning. So Husserl recognizes the descriptive capacity of scientific discourse, but at the same time, he's able to identify the limitations of that type of knowledge, which is unable to describe in a meaningful way the human condition. It's not enough to speak about facts. It's not enough to speak about what is demonstrable in the laboratory. We human beings have hunger for explanations that go far beyond. So Edmund Husserl diagnosed the crisis, which comes from a type of knowledge that is only within the limits of what the laboratory can prove, and that relies only on facts and a conception of universal truth, because the human condition is so complex that it requires methods of analysis that go beyond the strictly quantitative. But we'll get there in the later portion of this talk to reflect about how science becomes an ideology and what the impact of the capitalist mode of production is in the way in which science is advanced and the way in which science is applied in our society. First of all, I would like to speak about the way in which scientific discourse has been developed in the West. And for that, we have to look at the roots of scientific knowledge, which is the origin of that conception in which reason is above sense experience and rationality is seen as the primary and most effective way to understand reality. Where did this position come from? The answer is in the Western tradition, in the presocratics. The presocratics are a group of philosophers, the first philosophers in Western philosophy, who made the transition from myth to logos. Logos means rationality. They were able to see that myths, religion, the supernatural, are not necessary to understand the universe seen as a totality governed by rational laws. That's where the word cosmos comes from. A rationally governed totality. And the presocratics were the first to ask the question that is at the source of ontology, which is the realm of philosophy, or branch of philosophy that deals with what is being, how do we know being. And the presocratics establish a metaphysical distinction between the level of appearance and the level of essence. And they are going to say that being resides at the level of essence. How do we know that essence? Through rationality. They were able to identify that we have two ways to know reality. One is rationality and the other one is through the body, sense experience. And they established the hierarchy in which the mind and rationality are well above the body and sense experience. And presocratics like Zeno the disciple of Parmenides, are going to develop a series of paradoxes to show why movement, change, and time are mere illusions, and why rationality is the only faculty which allows us to understand how reality works. The presocratics encountered a universe full of different appearances and objects. We have stars, we have galaxies, we have planets, we have living beings. What is common to all of these things which exist in the cosmos? Is there a single essence which underlies everything that exists, like a common denominator? Or is the cosmos simply a collection of unrelated things, objects, living beings, etc.? The presocratics claimed that there was indeed an underlying essence, and that essence is what they called in Greek arche, or the cosmic principle, which makes up everything that exists. Now, different presocratics propose different arches, or cosmic principles. Thales of Miletus thought it was water, Heraclitus claimed it was fire, and Anaximander said it was the apeiron, or the undetermined. And the important thing is not to answer like we would today with scientific knowledge that the essence of everything that exists in the cosmos is, for example, atoms that make up all forms of matter throughout the universe, or even the periodic chart of elements, because the question that the presocratics proposed goes beyond simply saying that everything is made up of atoms, or simply pointing out to even the standard model of quantum mechanics and subatomic particles. It's not enough to just say what everything is made up of. The question, the fundamental question, and this is where ontology, the philosophical study of being, comes into play. The fundamental question that the presocratics asked is, what is being, where does being reside, and how can we know it? So if we say that atoms make up matter, we're not answering the ontological question, which is the real value and contemporary richness in thought of the presocratics. Because if it was just a question of saying what everything is made up of, then the presocratics wouldn't need to be studied today other than as a reference point in the history of ideas. It would be enough to just quote modern chemistry or physics. But no, they are relevant today because the question of being remains unanswered. So the presocratics established the hierarchy of reason and sense experience. They claim that reason is the only way to attain truth. And they establish an equation which says that truth equals being, and being can only be known through rationality. Sense experience leads us to error. Sense experience shows us what is multiple, what is varied, but it can never lead us to understand the essence of the cosmos. Now, the connection to contemporary science is, of course, the way in which rationality is idolized, the conception of an absolute truth that is waiting to be unearthed, unmasked behind the level of appearances. And so you can see why scientific discourse, positivist epistemology can be traced back to the presocratic conception of essence, rationality, and truth. After the presocratics, we jump a couple of hundreds of years into Plato and the sophists. Now, Plato is going to inherit that hierarchy of reason above sense experience, and he's going to create a metaphysical distinction based on that hierarchy, which is the world of ideas on one hand and the world of sense experience and the body on the other. The world of ideas is where absolute universal ideas reside independently of the human context. So you have the idea of beauty, you have the idea of justice, you have the idea of equality, you have mathematical theorems and geometry existing independently of human interpretation, human language, human history, or human context in general. And Plato is going to express this distinction between the two worlds in the allegory of the cave, or the myth of the cavern. And in the allegory of the cavern, or the cave, Plato asks us through Socrates to imagine a group of prisoners who have always lived in a cave. and the only thing that they know are the shadows which they look at projected on the wall because they are chained. They've never been to the outside world. They've spent all of their lives inside that cave. Behind them, there is a fire which projects all the objects and all the animals and all the people who go through the cave, and the prisoners only know the shadows. So, metaphorically, the shadows represent sense experience, reality as perceived through the body with the senses. And just as the prisoners believed that reality were only the shadows that they could watch on the wall of the cave, so do those who base their knowledge on sense experience believe that truth is what the senses show us, but truth is the outside world, the world of ideas. One day, one of the prisoners breaks his chains and escapes from the cave, and he needs to get accustomed to the sunlight, to the colors, to the shapes of the outside world. And when he returns to the cave, predictably, his fellow prisoners not only do not believe him that there is an outside world, but they actually kill him. So Plato derives a social and political message from this allegory, but I want to look at the epistemological consequences of the allegory of the cave, namely that rationality is the outside world, sense experiences are only the shadows on the cave. Sense experience is illusory, truth can only be attained through rationality. And Plato develops a concept which is episteme in Greek, and it means science, but in a universal sense, absolute truth, being able to contemplate the ideas as they exist in the world of ideas. And that is the foundation of what we call idealism. Now, in stark opposition to Plato, we have the sophists. The sophists are a group of philosophers who are going to propose that there is no absolute truth. There are no universal ideas existing independently of the human context of interpretation of language in some metaphysical dimension as Plato proposes, but the sophists are going to say that truth is a linguistic construct, and as such, what matters is not the ability to arrive at a single truth, which is the purpose of dialectics in Socrates, as Plato writes him. He's trying to apply the birth of ideas through a dialectical method that allows to contemplate universal archetypes in the world of ideas. But the sophists are going to say, no, there are no universal ideas, only linguistic constructs. So Protagoras is going to claim that man is the measure of all things because the world is an interpretation. We cannot know anything outside of our linguistic constructs, our codes, our knowledge, which are historically bound and are subjective, whether we like it or not. So for the sophists, the question is not to arrive at universal truths, but to create persuasive discourse. That's why rhetoric is born. So a sophist is more concerned with convincing his auditorium rather than with proving an absolutely universal truth. He is more concerned with persuasion, and that's where rhetoric and the analysis of language comes in. So since the time of Plato and the sophists, we can understand the history of epistemology as all schools of thoughts in the different branches of the social sciences either adopting the position of Plato or adopting the position of the sophists. For example, in historiography, which is the study of history, the history of how history is analyzed, the methods, and the epistemological discussions, in historiography we have on one side the positivists or the historicists who believe that historical events can be understood just like Plato thought about universal ideas, like a historian hopping up in a time machine and traveling to the past and reconstructing exactly and precisely what took place. And on the opposite shore, we have someone like Hayden White, who talks about historical knowledge as a discourse. And Hayden White would be the extent of the sophists echoing throughout the history of ideas. He's adopting the same perspective as the sophists, knowledge is a construct, a linguistic construct, a discourse, and there is no such a thing as a universal truth. So hermeneutics, interpretation of language, Foucault's genealogy, all of these methods of analysis, which became so popular in the so-called linguistic turn of the 20th century in philosophy and the humanities in general, all owe, in one way or another, to the position of the sophists. So it's important to see Plato represents what would later become in positivist thinking, the idea that there is an objective reality that can only be known through the scientific method. That Platonic idealism is the foundation of mathematical realism and scientific idealism. And the sophists are the foundation of all of those perspectives which are critical of that idealism. After that, we jump several millennia into modern philosophy. Now, modern philosophy begins with Descartes, and Descartes is going to develop something called methodical doubt. Methodical doubt is the capacity to admit that all forms of knowledge are susceptible to being doubted. So scientific knowledge, historical knowledge, everything can be thought of as not being true. But there is one thing that is not subject to methodical doubt, and that is that we exist because we think. So Descartes is going to formulate in Latin his famous cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. So the proof that we exist, the proof that we are, ontologically speaking, comes from the act of thinking, because it's the affirmation that there is a subject who thinks and interprets reality through the act of thinking. Now, Descartes is going to think in terms of a subject and an object. Plato, the sophists, and the presocratics didn't have the idea of the subject, especially the presocratics and Plato. They thought of reality as reality in itself, being, ideas, or the cosmic principle which makes up everything in the universe. But Descartes is going to think in terms of a subject and an object. Reality is an interpretation of the faculties of the mind, and is going to, for example, speak about innate ideas and the rational substance, so to speak, which creates the Cartesian subject, which is immutable, which is a priori before experience. After Descartes, we have John Locke, we have David Hume, and I'm going to speak specifically about David Hume in the tradition of the empiricists. David Hume is very interesting because he's going to propose in his famous work, Treatise on Human Nature, that the Cartesian immutable subject is actually something subject to change. It's actually something that depends on sense experience. So what we are as individuals, what he means by human nature, and it's the basis of modern psychology, it changes depending on what comes across the senses. It's not something that's fixed like Descartes thought. Now, David Hume on Inquiry and Human Understanding is going to say that all knowledge derives from sense experience. Sense experience is the privileged way in which we can know reality. And he's going to distinguish between relation of ideas and matters of fact. What are relations of ideas? Relations of ideas refer to mathematics and logic, that is self-reference systems. So when you think about Pythagoras' theorem, when you think about algebra, when you think about a syllogism in Aristotelian logic, those are self-reference systems that have absolute certainty because they are self-referenced. So you can say 1 + 2 = 3. You can say that a² + b² = c² because it's a self-reference system and there is 100% certainty. But when you look at matters of fact, those are the events that take place in reality, right? The real world outside of idealized systems of thought like logic and mathematics. And David Hume is going to say something very interesting, and that's where he is an aseptic. He's going to say, when we look at matters of fact, we look at propositions like tomorrow the sun will rise. That's the famous example he uses. And we usually think the proposition the sun will rise tomorrow has 100% certainty. But what we are overlooking is that the sun will rise tomorrow is a belief derived from a habit of association of sense experiences, which the mind has repeated over and over again to the point of generating a belief, which wears the mask of certainty, but it doesn't have the same certainty as 1 plus 2 equals 3 or of a syllogism in logic. And David Hume is going to say we cannot have the same certainty in matters of fact, or we cannot know reality in the same way that we have certainty in mathematics or logic. That's why he's an sceptic, because his scepticism is going to reflect itself on the fact that we cannot know reality with 100% certainty. And he's going to say that reality is an interpretation. Matters of fact are propositions, and what we think is certain on the level of matters of fact is just the mind creating beliefs out of habits of association. After David Hume, we have Kant, Immanuel Kant, 1724 till 1804. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is going to say, there is the thing in itself, in Latin, the noumena, there is phenomena. Phenomena is the interpretation of the thing in itself, because the thing in itself is unknowable. And Kant is going to identify two faculties with which we interpret reality: sense experience and rationality. And he's going to create something called transcendental philosophy, not in the sense of transcendence, of transcending something, but he's going to say transcendental means the a priori, so the conditions before experience, which allow us to know reality. And those conditions are what enable sense experience and rationality to create phenomena. So the mind creates reality. Now, we are approaching the roots of modern scientific discourse. So just to remind everyone, we looked at the presocratics. They talked about a universal truth. They talked about rationality being the only way we can know essence. We have Plato, who talked about episteme and the world of ideas. We have the modern philosophers who talked about the subject and object, the faculties with which the subject can understand and process and interpret reality. And now we're going to look at Newtonian absolutism first of all. So as you all know, Isaac Newton developed the three laws of motion in Principia Mathematica. He even developed the universal law of gravity. He came up with calculus, although there was a slight controversy with Leibniz. But Newton is arguably the greatest scientist who has ever lived. He revolutionized the way we understand the universe. And throughout many centuries, in fact, up until the 20th century with Einstein, Newtonian mechanics was believed to be an absolute form of knowledge. So in the Enlightenment, in the Industrial Revolution, we have many scientists who believed that Newton had been able to explain the totality of the cosmos and that there was really nothing left to explain. Newtonian physics was seen as an absolute form of knowledge. When do the cracks begin to form? Now, this absolutism leads to something called Laplacian determinism. Laplace was a French physicist and astronomer, and he once said to Napoleon that he could predict the behavior and movement of all particles just knowing their initial conditions. So determinism, the idea that the universe functions like the workings of a clock. Everything can be predicted, everything can be known with absolute certainty. Now, when do the cracks begin to form? Because this is a conception of truth embodied in the quantitative method. Everything that is susceptible to be quantified, to being demonstrated in a laboratory, can be known with full certainty. The cracks begin to form with quantum mechanics and Einstein's theory of general and special relativity. And now this absolutism before leads to positivism by Auguste Comte, and positivism is going to claim that reality can be known, that society goes through three different stages: first myth, then philosophy, and then science, which is the positive state and the highest form of knowledge. The cracks begin to form in that determinism when Einstein shows that the orbit of the planet Mercury cannot be completely calculated through Newtonian mechanics. So Newtonian mechanics is not absolute, it's not universal, it's not fully certain because it fails with the orbit of planet Mercury. So Einstein is going to show that space and time are not separate and are not absolute, that time varies depending on the velocity. In special theory of relativity, the faster something moves relative to another thing, then the flow of time is going to be different. It's going to be slower for the object that is moving faster relative to the object that is stationary. And if you reach the speed of light, then time stops. In general relativity, space and time form a fabric which is curved and bent by matter, and that's how gravity arises. But the fundamental rupture with Newtonian mechanics is going to come with quantum physics. For example, the double slit experiment. You have a group of physicists who want to know how particles behave. And so they shoot particles towards the double slit, and they have a screen behind the slits, and they want to see the pattern which the particles are going to form. And if they shoot particles, they expect particles to leave particle-like footprints, so to speak, on the screen. But what they find is more wave-like behavior, and they find that the observer, the act of observing, is going to affect whether the particle behaves as a wave or the wave as a particle. And they come up with the term duality. So in quantum mechanics, particles can exist as particles and waves simultaneously. You have Schrödinger's cat. Erwin Schrödinger, the quantum physicist, proposed the following paradox. Imagine a cat in a box with a mechanism that has a bottle of poison. Now, that mechanism has 50% probability of being activated. So there is 50% probability of the poison spreading within the box and the cat drinking it and therefore dying. But there is also 50% probability of the cat not drinking the poison and not dying. So Schrödinger says, until the box is opened, we cannot know for sure if the cat is alive or dead. And so in quantum mechanics, we would say there is a superposition, a duality. The cat is both alive and dead at the same time, just like the particle is a particle and a wave simultaneously. And we have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And Heisenberg says that we cannot predict the position and speed of an electron simultaneously. That's the uncertainty principle. Now, in today's physics, we have two very different theories: quantum mechanics at the level of the subatomic, and general relativity and special relativity at the level of the visible universe. And the question is, if scientific discourse reaches an absolute truth, then how can we have two very different theories to explain the same reality? Those are the crux of determinism and absolutism. Right. So now we can speak about scientific discourse as a form of ideology. Now, I want to give you two perspectives, one of Foucault and the other one of Jürgen Habermas. Now, Michel Foucault is going to analyze through his genealogy, which is derived from Nietzsche, and it's a method of understanding history. And he's going to analyze, for example, how discourse becomes an institution, exercises power, and consolidates social practices. In the case of science, in the 19th century, science begins to create institutions, not only universities, but hospitals, clinics, psychiatric clinics, and it begins to exercise a specific power on the body, what Foucault calls biopower. And it consolidates a series of social practices based on hierarchies, based on social rituals around doctors, around the authority of psychiatrists to determine what is madness and what is to be done with those who are deemed mad. And in that sense, historically, science becomes an ideology because it sustains institutions, above all the medical institution, and it defines what is normal, what is a deviation from that which is deemed normal, and that in turn is permeated by a complex relationship with politics and power structure. Now, Habermas is going to identify science in the Marxist sense as a force of production. Technology are a form of ideology because they are a force of production in capitalism, but also because scientific discourse, when it speaks about truth, when it speaks about understanding nature, it does so not in abstract, not in a disconnected way with society, but it does so following a very clear interest, which is the dynamics of capital and the economic interests of the capitalist system. So when we look at scientific discourse and capitalism, we can see that when the forces of production develop and technology advances, constant capital, which is the means of production, is going to displace variable capital, as Marx called it. Variable capital is human labor. So Marx was able to describe how in the 19th century, for example, the Industrial Revolution impoverished manual workers because machines were beginning to take over. And that reduces the amount of value commodities have. But there is an economic interest behind those technological and scientific developments, which is important to understand why scientific breakthroughs are not linear and are not ideological free in capitalism. So, for example, when an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates develops a new app or a new product in the electronic industry or in the computer industry or whatever it is, AI, quantum computing, no matter how advanced, all of these products are commodities, which means that scientific knowledge is the primary form of knowledge that drives capitalism, because those commodities derive from scientific knowledge. So there is an interest in how research is done and why quantitative methods are so important, because they are directed towards the production of commodities in the industrial technological sense. Now, progress in that sense is not linear. It's not motivated by a desire to advance humanity, to improve living conditions. There is something called programmed obsolescence, which means that every technological commodity produced under capitalism has a use value or a useful life, which is less than what technology could allow. So, for example, technologically, we could produce a computer that lasts 10 years, but it's more profitable to produce a computer that lasts 3 years and to force the consumer to buy an entirely new model instead of replacing or fixing the parts that are not functioning of the old model, which also has a terrible environmental impact. So research is done with the interest of capital behind it, with the interest of accumulation, with the interest of competition, with the interest not of improving living conditions, but of selling and increasing profit made by individual capitals. Now, everything that we've discussed so far leads to the question of what is the place of scientific methodologies of research in the humanities. Of course, they are useful. Of course, one may find a place for statistics, for what is empirically demonstrable, but human phenomena are so complex that we need to go beyond the strictly quantitative, and we need to look at the human condition through other forms of knowledge, such as literature, art, and philosophy, which are meaning-driven, not just explaining reality, but actually deriving meaning from those explanations. Speculation, artistic creation often produce knowledge which are universal as well. That is something that is often overlooked. If it wasn't universal, we wouldn't be able to read Homer or Shakespeare. We wouldn't be able to read Sophocles or the great playwrights of ancient Greece, because if art and literature were completely subjective, like the shadows Plato spoke about in the allegory of the cave, then we wouldn't be able to derive anything from that, because millennia have passed, and that would be something only the Greeks would be able to understand. But the fact we are able to be emotionally touched by Homer or Shakespeare proves that there is something universal in literature, and there is something profoundly valuable in unearthing those other forms of knowing reality, which are not based on quantitative methods, but are based on speculation, philosophical abstraction, art, literary creation, to show that science is not the only form that we humans can understand the world, and it shouldn't be the privileged form of discourse and knowledge. We must go beyond. Thank you very much for listening.